My next guest is Bob Mazur, also known as the Infiltrator. Little background on Bob. He's earned global acclaim as one of the world's leading experts on the financial escapades of the underworld. There is no one with more first-hand knowledge about how international banks and businesses cater to those who own the nearly $2 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars in criminal proceeds laundered annually. For years in the eyes of organized crime leaders, Bob was a highly successful mob-connected money launderer that helped manage their illicit fortunes. His clients, some of the most famous and deadly drug cartel bosses, Pablo Escobar, offered a $500,000 price tag for his head when arrests were made around the world and he was revealed to be a highly trained U.S. federal undercover agent. Bob is the author of The Infiltrator. You got to get the book, folks. The Infiltrator, a memoir about his undercover life, much of which was spent acting as a conduit between ruthless drug barons and corrupt, legitimate-appearing senior executives that cleaned billions, with a B, billions of dollars in blood-stained money through their otherwise respectable international banks and businesses. Bob has transformed his underworld experience and current-day involvement in the money laundering field into a remarkable lesson for today's business sector. After completing a highly decorated 27-year career as a federal agent in 3 U.S. agencies, Bob is now the president of KYC Solutions, Incorporated, a firm that provides speaking, expert witness, and consulting services to companies worldwide. Bob's book, The Infiltrator, is now available in 10 languages in more than 50 countries and is the basis for the internationally released major motion picture by the same name starring Bryan Cranston, Diane Kruger, and other internationally known cast members. For more information about Bob Mazur, his book, and the film based on his life, they can be found at Robert Mazur, M-A-Z-U-R, robertmazur.com. Bob, welcome back to Operation Freedom.
No, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
So, Bob, I mentioned this before, but it bears repeating again. I was on a plane not too long ago, and they were showing the movie The Infiltrator, right? So every time I have a chance to watch it, since it's my favorite movie, I watch it, and I'm watching it. The guy sitting next to me starts kind of like leaning over, and he kind of taps me and goes, "What are you watching?" I go, "Oh, this movie, The Infiltrator." "Oh, how did you get that?" And I showed him how he gets it, and he's watching it, right? And he gets done watching it, and he says, "That was an incredible movie. Man, imagine if that was actually true." I said, "Well, no, it is true. It's based on the book, The Infiltrator." And he said, well, "That's like incredible." So, Bob, educate our listeners, because we have thousands of new listeners every week over the internet from around the world. Educate our listeners on why that guy was so enthralled with the movie and the information you presented in your book and in the movie, The Infiltrator.
Sure. Well, my book is factual. The movie, of course, Hollywood takes their creative rights and kind of dramatizes things here and there. So not every single thing in the movie happened, but a lot of it did. And I was a federal agent for 27 years and worked on major money laundering cases that were global in nature. And eventually, after about 14 years of working as an agent, I got the opportunity to do a long-term undercover assignment, and I was trained as a long-term undercover agent. And my background is a little different than a lot of other law enforcement officers. I have a business administration finance degree. I have an extensive amount of accounting background. I worked in a bank and a brokerage firm, and I had the ideal background for a person who would ultimately attempt to pose as a corrupt businessman. And so after learning how to the science of long-term undercover, I got the opportunity to work with a team. And this is really important for me to stress, because I was blessed to be a member of a team and earn a leadership role on that team. And I got the opportunity to ultimately become the primary undercover agent in an undercover operation that infiltrated Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. And so I slowly began with my partner to win confidence of members, participants in the Medellin cartel, and then ultimately we were dealing directly with people who reported straight to Pablo Escobar, many of the people who were very, very critical to the Medellin cartel's success, and actually were working on behalf of Pablo Escobar through his primary lawyer, a guy by the name of Santiago Uribe, who was my point of contact, one of my points of contact in the cartel. And I also became a conduit for them to what was then the 7th largest privately held bank in the world, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. BCCI that had an insatiable appetite to launder underground proceeds for any bad guy from whatever walk of the underworld might come across their door. And that was a 2-year long-term undercover operation that ultimately led in the indictment and conviction of nearly 100 drug traffickers and money launderers. I think we seized about 3,200 pounds of cocaine and had asset forfeitures and seizures of about $600 million. So, and when I was at the bank, I was dealing with people on the board level and other major officers in the bank that were carrying out an institutional plan of soliciting deposits from the underworld. So it was a very, very unusual ride in the underworld, to say the least.
So, Bob, when this guy looks at me and he goes, "So, how do you know this is true?" And I go, "Well, you know Bryan Cranston, who played the lead role in this?" He goes, "Yeah." I go, "Well, it's based on a guy I know, Bob Mazur." He goes, "Really?" I go, "Yeah." And then he said, "So he retired after this, right?" And I knew the answer to this, Bob, but I wasn't about to say the answer. I just looked at him and I said, "Well, wouldn't you?" and he goes, "Oh yeah, are you kidding? If I live through this, like this guy Bob," he goes, "Well, I'd go to the beach for as many years as I could." And Bob, you've never spoken about this before. So did you retire after that?
No, I didn't. I was approached by the Drug Enforcement Administration to do another long-term undercover operation, posing as a money launderer again, but this time with a different target. The target was the Cali Cartel in Colombia, which gave me some pause because Cali and Bogota are probably about 200 miles apart, and I was already marked by leaders of the Medellin cartel with a contract on my life. But I definitely felt as though that the experience that I got in the first undercover operation put me in a position to be substantially more effective in that role. And I really wanted to take this opportunity to attempt to continue to pull the veil of secrecy off of the relationship that exists between, unfortunately, a fairly good amount of businesses and banks around the world, and certain individuals within those entities that solicit this type of money. So it was probably about 2-3 years after the end of Operation Sea Chase, which is the Infiltrator story, that I finished putting together another identity and began to put together the undercover operation that we did at DEA. I wound up testifying in trials as it relates to that, and I did testify before a congressional subcommittee about that case, but I've not, other than in those venues, I've never talked about this.
So let's talk about, if you so choose, it turns out that some of the entities you ended up dealing with when you were dealing with this infiltration then of the Cali Cartel was some folks associated with the KGB, right?
Yeah, as part of the operation, I was at times physically in Panama City, Panama for extended periods of time. And I can tell you at that period of time, which would have been in the early 1990s, from my perspective, Panama was somewhat the underworld's Star Wars bar. I mean, there were more. You couldn't walk the street without bumping into a drug trafficker, a money launderer, an organized crime guy, a dirty lawyer, you name it. I mean, it was a playground. And I dealt with some pretty unusual people there. One guy who offered to share his office with me is a guy by the name of Gilbert Straub, S-T-R-A-U-B. And Gilbert was pretty well known. There were books written about him before I made contact with him because he was formerly one of the principal lieutenants for Robert Vesco.
Oh.
And he ran his New Jersey operations before Vesco and Straub and others fled the U.S. when they were indicted on SEC violations. But he was also the guy who had orchestrated the delivery of $50,000 in currency to individuals who got that money to the Watergate burglars to hush them up. But he had friends in the Italian organized crime and Russian organized crime as well. And he ultimately introduced me to one of the biggest players in Panama, who is a fellow from Russia by the name of Jorge Krupnik. And Krupnik has since then passed away. But at the time that I was dealing with him, he had a really luxurious office at the top floor of Banco Exterior, the Banco Exterior building in Panama. He was the guy in charge of weapons procurement for the country of Panama during the Noriega regime. And in fact, when our troops invaded Panama, one of the places that Noriega and his bodyguards were hiding out was Krupnik's house. And then Krupnik convinced Noriega to go to the Holy See's embassy in Panama, and that's where the U.S. authorities finally got him. But the interesting thing for me about Krupnik was that he was very, very close to a lady who was the personal secretary to the number 2 guy in the KGB. And at around this time is around the time that the Soviet Union fell. Mm-hmm. And when they did, I can tell you that everybody from the Panama Star Wars bar of the underworld was going to Russia. They were going to Russia to establish relationships with people within the government who were selling off rights to commit, to run criminal activities there. It was clear that that was the time when it was a free-for-all for people to get to Russia for the purposes of establishing as much of their criminal base as they possibly could there. And Krupnik already had a playground of corruption in Panama, and became therefore a very, very attractive candidate for that. But when he was in Panama, he operated renting of freighters, had a very, very big prominent operation in the ports in Panama. He was basically capable of smuggling anything, anywhere. Had unlimited access to aircraft, shipping facilities, and other equipment that operated in the ports and airports of Panama. So he offered to me very interesting services, like the exchange of U.S. currency for any type, this is drug money, for any types of goods that I wanted anywhere in the world, or gold bars, or to cover that money up with fictitious sales of emeralds, or transporting U.S. currency aboard commercial airlines maintained in Panama, laundering drug money through contacts in Vegas, exchanging currency in Panama for currency stockpiled in Colombia, investing drug proceeds in the port of Cristobal in Panama, and actually helping to build the infrastructures in Panama with the understanding that if we put some of the drug money in there, that we would be able to have free use of the infrastructures for whatever it is that we wanted to do. So it was a very, very interesting group of individuals that I got the opportunity to deal with in that second operation. And I did come to learn that the Cali Cartel, in my view, was far more sophisticated than the Medellin Cartel. Mm. They had some very, very unique methods of manipulating export transactions, falsifying documents, and I became very, very much involved in those money laundering processes with businessmen out of Colombia and Panama, and bankers as well. So it was similar to my ride in the Infiltrator, but one of the other things that was very different about this second operation, and something that was very, very difficult and has been very difficult for me to carry, is that it turned out that the officer who was put with me to work as my partner was on the take, and was actually ultimately on the payroll of the Cali Cartel, our targets of the investigation. So, and I worked undercover in Colombia and in other places during the time that I didn't know that the highest levels of people in the Cali Cartel knew that I was a DEA undercover agent. It
almost got you killed, didn't it, Bob?
I almost got kidnapped if that had happened,
yeah, you were done.
I would have been done. Yeah, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So, but it's amazing, and something I think that's extremely important for your listeners to know, that the power that we now see of illicit monies running through Russia, which I think really got a bolt, a big bolt in the arm during this time frame that I was just talking about, has now led to the scandals that we see day in and day out. There's a thing called the Russian laundromat, which your listeners should definitely Google. One of the best sources for information about that is the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP. It's about 400 journalists globally who do their best to try to expose corruption around the world. Many of them have been killed. There have been several this year who have been killed in different parts of the world for exposing corruption and the movement of this type of illicit money. In the Russian laundromat case, there was $20 billion that was moved. In the Deutsche Bank mirror trading case, there was $10 billion that was moved. These are all up in the Baltic areas. The Danske Bank, $200 billion moved in that case. There's one called the Azerbaijani, I got it, laundromat, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. $2.9 billion that was moved, and then there's the Troika Bank matter that's $8.8 billion that was moved, and a lot of these cases have been exposed as a result of the work of the OCCRP, and it definitely is something worth following, because the information they put out is it's just mind blowing.
So here's, you mentioned that, this Russian involvement and the Russian mafia. Bob, several years ago, I was in Athens, Greece, and I was by the one of the docks there, ports, and there was this huge ship. I mean, like an enormous personal ship. And I said to somebody by the dock, my wife is always like, "Don't go talk to any of these people. This is not a good thing to do." You know me, just go up, boom. I said, "So who owns this?" And they give me some Russian name, right? I go, "What does this person do?" You don't want to know. Okay. So then, about a year later, I'm in Venice, and there's this enormous, huge ship, personal ship. I do the same thing. My wife's, "Don't be going to talk to you." Here I go again. Same thing. Who owns this? So-and-so, Russian name. What does this person do? We don't know. My point, Bob, is that it appears that Russian organized crime has really prospered over the past several decades, and it could well be tied to what you experienced starting in the early 90s.
Yeah, I think it is. And by the way, I was in Nevis early in the beginning of this year, putting on a training session for
money laundering, right?
No, it's funny. My daughter sometimes asks me, "Dad, do you go to these money laundering havens to teach them how to or how not to?" I say, no, we're trying to teach them how not to and how to identify risk. But while I was there was this massive personal yacht that was anchored there, and it was owned by an oligarch, and it was commonly known, and and Nevis has been doing some positive things actually to try to get their game higher in the anti-money laundering world, but there must be a reason that oligarch was there.
So, Bob, let me when you got done with the Infiltrator operation, which involved Escobar, and then you were involved. Then you went into the Cali Cartel takedown or operation. How did Mrs. Mazur handle that?
Well, we've supported one another since she was 16 and I was 18, and I think that's the answer. And she is the most understanding best friend that anybody could ever have. and very, very driven for causes as well. So she's an educator, and right now actually volunteers to be the literary coordinator for a charitable organization that provides education to children with Down syndrome. So we have our causes, and we have common beliefs, and I'm a very, very lucky man.
You and me both, Bob.
Yep.
Bob, is there a way? Now, some people are going to say, "Well, man, these folks have these Russian oligarchs, these cartels. They have so much money, so much influence, so much power that the genie's out of the bottle. There's nothing that can be done to bring these individuals and organizations down." What do you say to that, Bob?
I don't believe that, and I may be swinging swords at a windmill, but I really do believe that one of the things we need to do is we need to recognize that what we're doing is not working.
Right.
And we have to be willing to open our mind to new ideas. And I've written papers about this, and I think I've given them to you before, but I'll gladly send them to you, put them on your website, about how I think the global law enforcement community could do a much more effective job.
And we're going to go more in depth in this in an Insider Insight interview. Bob has agreed to come back on our Insider Insight show. And Bob, I'd like to thank you, not just for that, for everything you have done in your entire career. And I'd like to thank your wife and your family for allowing you to keep not only our country, but our world a much safer place